Hello, everyone. I'm Clay Whitehead, the co-CEO and co-founder of Presence Learning. I want to welcome you to the second in our three-part webinar series on school climate change and strategies for encouraging positive behavior. I'm sure that you know that Presence Learning provides live online speech therapy, occupational therapy, behavior interventions, mental health services, and assessment services to schools across the country. And for 3 years now, we've sponsored the SPED Ahead webinar series with an audience of nearly 20,000 educators. To kick off the 2015 Fall Series, Dr. Joe Ryan delivered a mini course on how to use data to make better decisions about behavioral interventions. The response has been overwhelmingly positive. Now we're going to get an update on the impact of some recent legislation and how positive behavior supports can make our behavior interventions less reactive, more supportive, and ultimately more effective. This webinar could not be more timely and relevant because you've told us that finding new ways to deal with disruptive behavior and its negative effect on our classrooms is a top priority for you. And part of your concern, and ours, especially with new laws, is avoiding use of extreme measures like restraint and seclusion, and to instead implement evidence-based positive practices that reduce problem behaviors and create an inviting and engaging environment for teachers and students alike. And so, we are thrilled to have with us for the next 90 minutes two of the leading proponents and experts on positive behavior intervention supports, Dr. Michael Gamel-McCormick and Dr. Daniel Crimmins. Michael is going to give us a quick overview and a legal policy update, and then Dan is going to guide us through a range of essential information to inform your school climate change initiatives. We'll conclude the webinar with Q&A. If you have questions for Michael and Dan, just use the submit box to send us your questions. We also invite you to follow the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag SPEDAhead. Let me tell you a little about each of them before we get started. Michael has spent decades studying and working on issues affecting students with disabilities in schools and has done much work around restraint and seclusion in schools and numerous other educational issues. Since 2014, he has been the Associate Executive Director in the Association of University Centers on Disabilities, AUCD. Prior to his current position, he was the Disability Policy Director with the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions under the chairmanship of Senator Tom Harkin and the Dean of the College of Education and Public Policy at the University of Delaware. Michael is also co-author of the popular book, Young Children with Special Needs, A Developmentally Appropriate Approach. Dan is professor and director for the Georgia State University Center for Leadership and Disability. He is an authority on restraint and seclusion and on the use of positive and preventative supports in schools. Dan has been working in this field for many years and played a key role in Georgia's adoption of regulations on the use of restraint and seclusion. He has been at the forefront of bringing new and emerging practices into everyday use. His work with Michael Durand on the Motivation Assessment Scale was among the first efforts to quickly assess the functions of challenging behaviors. The book he co-authored, Positive Strategies for Students with Behavior Problems, is a groundbreaking guide to developing positive behavior support plans with effective solutions for educators from grades K through 12. So, Michael, it's over to you to start unpacking this important topic.
Clay, thank you very much for that introduction, and I appreciate the opportunity to address the important topic today of seclusion and restraint. What my goal is here for these first couple of minutes is to give you an introduction to what the policy atmosphere is like regarding restraint and seclusion. So I want to give you a little bit of a history, a little bit of the sense of what the federal level has happened, and a little bit of what's been happening at the state level as well. Let me dive right in and talk about where this issue came from, at least within the last decade or so. Back in 2008, some of the members of the House of Representatives in the United States Congress asked for a report on what was happening in public schools related to restraint and seclusion. Specifically, George Miller from California asked the GAO to look at how often that practice was actually taking place and what the outcomes of that practice were. That report was done and issued in May of 2009, and that report found that a number of things. Two of the most important things were that there seemed to be significant instances of restraint and seclusion happening in schools that were accompanied with injuries and, in some cases, deaths. And the second big finding was that there was no systematic data being collected around the issue. So some school districts kept track, some did not. States did not have requirements around this. What was clearly a problem, it was unknown how large that particular problem actually was. As I mentioned, Representative George Miller from the 7th District of California was interested in this issue. He was concerned, and he happened to be in a position where he could look deeper into it. He was the chairperson of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, and in May of 2009, he held a hearing on the issue. That hearing included testimony from members of individual school districts, from researchers, and probably most significantly from a mother whose child had been restrained and had suffered significant trauma. That hearing was the impetus for the first piece of federal regulation around this particular issue. So in December of that same year, Representative Miller, along with his Republican counterpart, Kathy McMorris Rodgers from Washington State, introduced a bill, and that bill was called the Preventing Harmful Restraint and Seclusion in Schools Act. The bill worked its way through Representative Miller's committee. It came out of committee with a strong bipartisan vote, and it eventually went to the House floor. And in May of 2010, it passed the House by a vote of 262 to 153. Again, this was a fairly bipartisan vote that occurred at that time. After passage, the Senate needed to take up the issue, and Senator Chris Dodd from Connecticut introduced his own version of the bill called Keeping All Students Safe Act. That piece of legislation was introduced in the Senate in September of 2010. But the committee of jurisdiction for that bill did not take up the bill, and the full Senate didn't consider the bill, and it died at the end of that congressional session, which was at the end of December in 2010. So both the House bill and the Senate bill did not move forward during that session. Since 2010, we have not seen a restraint and seclusion bill pass either the House or the Senate. That passage back in 2010 in the House was the last time that a bill actually passed one of the chambers. We have, however, seen a number of efforts to get legislation through Congress. There have been two efforts in the Senate, one in the 112th Congress and one in the 113th Congress. Both of those bills were introduced by Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa. There have been three efforts in the House that were offered, two of those by Representative George Miller, and then just most recently, this past January, Representative Beyer from Virginia introduced the latest version. As I've said, none of these bills have passed out of committee or have been considered by either house of the Congress. But I want to make an important point here. Just because they haven't been passed out of their chambers doesn't mean that they haven't had an impact. And in fact, the construction of these bills has been carefully looked at by other entities, state legislatures, some of the federal agencies, to consider recommendations around what prohibitions there should be and how schools should be considering the issue of restraint and seclusion. So while a law hasn't been passed, these bills, the introduction of these bills and the considerations of these bills has had an impact on the policy over the past decade or so. The other place that you're seeing some federal activity around restraint and seclusion is in the individual agencies, and specifically in the United States Department of Education. In May of 2012, that department released a resource document that included 15 principles around which schools should be looking at their policies related to restraint and seclusion. One of the key policy principles that the department emphasizes is that restraint and seclusion should only be used in situations where the child's behavior poses imminent, and that means immediate danger of serious physical harm to self or others. And the department follows that up by saying that once that danger is past, the restraint or the seclusion should be ended. Those 15 principles are strong principles and should absolutely be looked at by every school district when they're considering their policies around this issue. I do want to point out as well that there are some private companies that are beginning to look at these issues too, and one is a large insurer. School districts who carry insurance have to listen to some of the preferences of their insurers, and one of the largest reinsurers in the country that insures school districts is Munich Re, and Munich Re has strongly suggested that schools have in place policies that reduce or completely eliminate the use of restraint and seclusion in their schools. Since 2008, there have been over 39 states that have passed legislation related to restraint and seclusion, many of those using portions of the bills that were introduced into Congress, and also the guidelines that the Department of Education has passed as well. Unfortunately, we continue to see restraint and seclusion occurring in schools, and in 2014, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee of the Senate issued a report documenting 10 different cases of restraint and seclusion where families actually could not get the school district to stop using restraint and seclusion with their children. In most of those cases, families had to actually move to make the district stop using them with their daughter or their son. So the issue, while being addressed by states, has still not gone away, and there's still a need to address this issue. All of that is context as we go in and listen to Dan Crimmins talk about some of the specific ways to address the challenging behaviors that students have and to hopefully prevent situations where restraint and seclusion would need to be used in an emergency situation. Thanks for allowing me to take the time to set the table for this issue, and I'm going to turn things over to Dan Crimmins at this point.
Well, thank you, Michael, for those introductory remarks, and thank you, Clay, for hosting this today. I have three broad issues that I want to talk about today with you. One of them is a little bit of an examination of school discipline codes generally and how they are reactive, how we use codes of conduct that usually talk about how to use the discipline code, mostly in terms of what are the punishments that would follow a behavior, whether those are in or out of school suspension. And as Michael introduced us to the idea that restraint and seclusion are still used in the schools in many states. Our big concern with that we'll talk about and return to a couple different times is the disproportionate use of reactionary procedures with students of color and students with disabilities. The next set of topics then is really in a pretty ambitious way trying to cover the world of positive behavior support in one quick lesson. We'll be talking about it as a tiered system of support implemented at the large group, small group, and individual levels, how this is an emerging standard of practice, how there are essential elements at each level, and how it's based on evidence-based approaches. And part of our time, we'll spend more of our time on Tier 3, the individualized approaches, as these are the students who are most likely to experience reactive strategies. I also think it's important to spend a little bit of time talking about what we don't know and what the limits on our evidence are. And finally, we will talk a little bit about some of the issues about in going to scale, the idea of implementation of positive behavior supports and how its effect on school climate. And we'll refer a little bit to the role of law and regulation and policy, some of the steps in that process, some of the necessary components in planning for that process, the importance of the idea called fidelity to the procedures that we use. And then I'll leave with a little bit of time focusing on how we have to move to become more efficient, more effective, and how we have to continue to examine sustainability. Let's start with school discipline codes. probably everyone in the audience who attended school, which is probably everyone in the audience, remember some kind of a code of conduct that usually talked about what you're not allowed to do, the prohibited behaviors. And usually there was a set of consequences, often a hierarchical set of consequences that matched the level of behavior and whether something was repeated or not repeated, and I'll say matching the punishment to the crime. The code of conduct may have talked about exclusionary discipline that might be used in school or out of school suspension. One of the things we want to be sensitive to here is that suspension leads to lost instructional time, and that's a concern for students who are often most in need of instruction are then sometimes losing that instructional time. And finally, restraint and seclusion are often outlined in the plans, but these are things that we want to be very cautious about their use ever, because they're so dangerous for both the giver and the receiver, and Michael made some reference to that a little bit earlier. I've just got a couple of select examples here on this slide that, as Michael referred to earlier, there are a number of different examples of disproportionality. Expulsion rates, for example, boys are 4.5 times more likely than girls to be expelled from school. Suspension rates, African American students 3 times more likely than white students. Restraint procedures, 75% of the students restrained are students with disabilities, relative to only 12% of the population. Seclusion, used 58% of the incidents, the uses of seclusion are students with disabilities, again, relative to 12% of the population. At the school level, what this means is that those schools that focus more on discipline, unfortunately, end up focusing less on positive school climate. Another concern about this is that reactive disciplinary approaches, restraint or seclusion or suspensions, become a default behavior intervention plan for too many students. Suspension, restraint, seclusion are systemic responses to students with challenging behavior. It's what we know how to do. The problem is that they tend to be repeated with the same students over and over again. And the even greater problem is that there's no evidence that reactive discipline is effective. So regulations and legislation are an important step toward limiting their use, but long-term solutions require a more positive, more constructive response by schools and districts. So what do we do instead? We must use the principles of behavior change to develop alternatives to our established way of doing things. We have to understand that reactive approaches are based in a tradition, but not data. And in order to change, we have to build organizational support and commitment to the implementation of evidence-based practices that improve school climate and student behavior. And this is really then the crux of what we'll be talking about today, is the broad area called positive behavior support. As we start this discussion, I like to begin with my working assumptions about challenging behavior and the students that we serve. Starting with that challenging behaviors are largely inconvenient to both the doer and the receiver. I don't think that students are out there being diabolical, plotting to say, how do I have an effect on my teacher or this other person here? I think that they are the kinds of behaviors that get a student in trouble. They are inconvenient to both the person doing them and the person receiving them. And if that person had a better way of making their needs known, they would use it. We look at persistent behaviors as forms of communication which persist, in fact, because they work in getting the person something that he or she had wanted. That students with persistent, challenging behaviors have encountered frequent efforts to get them to stop, often hundreds or thousands of attempts. And this is one of those times that I say, and if saying no, or stop, or cut it out, or using punishment, or some other reactive procedure was going to work, it would have worked already. So where do we start? We look to say that the best solution to challenging behavior is teaching new or replacement skills that can be used at the times and places where problems now occur. So positive behavior support in the schools. We often refer to this as PBIS, as a shorthand for positive behavior intervention and support. This is a 3-tiered approach based on a public health model where you consider primary prevention for everyone in a population and effective for 80 to 90%. Some secondary prevention, a more targeted prevention for a smaller number, 5 to 15%, and intensive or tertiary level supports for a few, 1 to 5%. Primary prevention, the large volume at the bottom of a pyramid here is primary prevention efforts affecting 80% of a population. The one notch up, the yellow version of this pyramid shows the secondary prevention group and a very small number of folks at the tip of the pyramid looking at tertiary level prevention approaches. So when we start with Tier 1, universal approaches, here we would be talking about different kinds of interventions or supports that would be used school-wide or classroom-wide in a school, and that would be there for all students. So the essentials of PBIS are, first, that a school or a school district makes a commitment to fulfilling this, and there's a number of ways that this is done in terms of assessing readiness and advanced planning. That at the school level, they develop 3 to 5 behavioral rules that are stated positively. And here's an example of themes that are used in many schools: be safe, be responsible, be respectful. Those 3 rules are then operationalized by setting within the school, within the classroom, within the hallways, within the cafeteria, within the gymnasium. The rules and the behaviors are practiced, that they are reinforced, and that data are collected that demonstrate effectiveness. Some of these points were illustrated last month in the talk by Dr. Joe Ryan, who spent a great deal of time talking about the importance of data collection and how it can be used in decision-making about these programs. Now, these approaches can also be integrated with a number of other models and approaches that happen at the universal level. There can be universal screening for mental health concerns. There can be a school mental health model that's in place in this particular school or district. That there might be a social emotional learning curriculum, or there may be other school climate initiatives that are being utilized. And here are just a couple of what I call the brand names of evidence-based social emotional learning programs. There's a program called Promoting Alternative Thinking Strategies, or PATHS. Second Step, Why Try, Incredible Years. The last of these, the CERTS project, SCERTS, will be the focus of next month's webinar with Dr. Barry Prezant and colleagues. Universal approaches can also be used in the classroom. Here are some brand names of evidence-based approaches: classroom checkup, good behavior game, the classroom management self-assessment, promoting positive and effective learning environments, classroom checklist. So there's, again, a number of different ways. Many of these are supported by whole books written about how to do them, how to implement them. But they have components. In this case, the example is classroom checkup and provides the background using motivational interviewing, but assessing a classroom, providing some feedback to the teacher on how that is structured, coming up with a menu of options as to what might be done to improve overall conduct and overall engagement of students in the classroom, picking an intervention that would accomplish that, and then supporting the teacher in monitoring the carrying out of that intervention to ensure that it's being done the way it's supposed to be done. This idea of treatment integrity. How do we assess this? What kinds of data do we collect? On the negative side, we might be collecting, are students being referred to the office for discipline reasons? Are students being suspended or expelled? Do we have incident reports that we're tracking? Do we have attendance data at the school level for the students? Do we have attendance data for the teachers? To what degree are we retaining students that we want to retain in school, and are they making academic progress? Do we have ratings of school climate? Do we have progress monitoring on specific aspects of student behavior? Do we have examples of positive student behavior? Do we have Fidelity checklists with regard to all of these approaches and how they're used? At the school level, we implement a system that is designed to support all students. The intent and expectation is that everyone will be positively affected by both the establishment of clear rules and expectations, the support for very specific positive behaviors, and that the overall school climate will be enhanced by the introduction of the PBIS system. Now, there will be some students that do need extra support, and for these students, we would talk about Tier 2, secondary or targeted approaches, that students will need extra attention, that students are at risk for some reason or another. They may be experiencing some form of family trauma, or they may have some kind of disruption in their life, or they may have some other vulnerability, but that we know some things about what to do for them, that we can, I don't want to say plug them in, but we can provide a standardized program or a small group that supports them. And when we do this, we expect that they should be, I'll say, relatively rapid response to this. It's efficient in that we can work with several students at a given time, and that this is really consistent with the model that is response to intervention and the requirements that students be supported with evidence-based practices when we know they require that support without necessarily going through a classification procedure for special education. So some examples: check in, check out is evidence-based approach. It's pretty simple in many ways. There's daily meetings beginning and then end of the day. A student meets with an adult to review what behaviors they might be needing to show later that day or during the day and at particular times that may be known to be problematic. And at the end of the day, there's a how'd it go, how'd you do, kind of an attaboy, attagirl opportunity to say that it looks like you handled things well. So that's an evidence-based approach that my next slide will show some of the details of that, can have a great impact on students who are at risk. A school might also have a more general social skills curriculum that identifies specific skills that are important for success in the school, whether that's cooperation with the teachers, independent play, or independent functioning in the cafeteria, or waiting for the bus, some of those times of day that students have more trouble with. Here's the specifics on check-in and check-out. A team identifies target behaviors for a given student, creates goals that address those target behaviors. The checker is identified, an adult who is known to the student, who is liked by the student, who has a rapport with the student. The student checks in with that checker every morning. The checker provides the student with the check-in, check-out card that lists the behaviors and the point goals for the day, assuming this is tied into some kind of a point system. The student takes the check-in, check-out card to all their classes. Teachers rate the student's behavior on the check-in, check-out card at the end of each class, offering the student immediate feedback on that behavior. At the end of the day, the student checks out with the checker. The checker summarizes the data, gives the student feedback, and administers reinforcement. The student then takes the check-in, check-out card home for parents to sign and acknowledge the student's behavior. And the next morning, the student returns the signed card to the checker, and the cycle starts all over again. So it's operationalized, it's highly specific, it targets very specific behaviors for the student, but provides opportunities for them to be reinforced and rewarded for demonstration of appropriate behavior throughout the day. So this slide shows the Tier 2, some of the data that we might be collecting, and you can see that it's really, I just recycled the slide from the universal Tier 1 level, that we would be interested in office referrals and suspension, expulsion incidents, attendance, academic achievement. The monitoring of progress would be the specific item here that would be most relevant to students at the Tier 2 level. That and the positive student behaviors. Then we move to Tier 3, and these are the tertiary or individualized approaches. And so for those behaviors, those students with behaviors that persist, despite the implementation of Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports, with Fidelity. And so we want to make sure that those Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports are being provided in the way that they're designed to be, in the way that they are described in the literature. For those students, we would then start the individualization of what do we have to do. And in this case, then, we start with a process that looks at that student's behavior in using a set of techniques called a functional behavioral assessment, and often referred to as an FBA. And we would conduct that because a student whose behaviors are persisting despite those other supports are probably those behaviors are impeding learning, which is the condition under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that would call for the FBA to be provided. The FBA is then used to guide the development of a behavior intervention plan, and that usually outlines some environmental changes and a teaching plan for replacement behaviors. For children receiving special education supports, FBAs and BIPs are a civil right, as specified in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, because they really are the means of assuring that that student has access to a free and appropriate public education. So I want to just emphasize this, that the IDEA as a law talks about these procedures, the FBA as a procedure, the BIP as a plan, as a guide, because students' behaviors that impede learning are not getting, therefore, their free and appropriate public education. And so that is why they are specifically written into the law. Now, as we do this, I've found it helpful to use my three components to being, this is what we think of for individualized positive behavior supports. That the first item that we have to consider is we must understand those behaviors. We must observe, we interview, we generate a hypothesis about why this behavior continues. And these are all the parts of a functional behavioral assessment. Then we want to use that information to identify ways to minimize the behavior, to prevent it from occurring. We sometimes talk about this as antecedent manipulations, kind of the technical term there, and this is the first component of a behavior support plan. And then we want to also use the opportunity created by these prevention strategies to identify what are the new skills or alternative behaviors that need to be taught as part of a behavior intervention plan so that the students may, in fact, no longer need these behaviors. What are the components of a positive behavior support plan? Well, first, let's start with the fact that the planning begins with the statement that the student has value and we respect the student. Sometimes this is one of the more difficult steps in the process, quite frankly, that there are students who have, because of their high levels of behavior, or perhaps the behavior is perceived to be dangerous or puts the student at risk or others at risk, that it's sometimes hard to step back to say, isn't this a great kid? It's very hard to do planning for a student who has burned all of his or her bridges. And so one of the steps in the planning process is to come back and reflect on who is this person, how have they gotten to be this point in their life, and what can we do to engage them again. We then go through different kinds of measurement activities to identify the context for behavior. We want to generate a hypothesis that says, what is the function of the behavior? What is the purpose served by that behavior? As I mentioned in the last slide, we want to identify prevention strategies. We want to identify interventions that we might use, but we want to make sure those interventions are tied to the function, and we want to make sure that those interventions have an evidence base to support them. We want to pull all of that together into an instructional plan. And then that plan can only be delivered if that instructional team, the teacher, if there are related service providers, paraeducators involved, then those folks also need to be some kind of support and the training to make sure that they are able to provide this support for the student. Now, implementing this plan, I want to say there really is a technology of positive behavior support. There's a true expertise, and it requires a commitment, it requires a knowledge base. And this is not something that you can do sort of saying, oh, gee golly, isn't this an important thing to do? Yes, it is, and it's so important that we really need to learn about it. It also starts with this idea of person-centered values as a critical aspect of planning, that who is this person and what does the student value, what are their goals and aspirations, and how do we build on them to engage that student further in the learning process. We really need to understand function, why this behavior makes sense to the student. This is a critical first step in getting started in identifying replacement skills. Those skills have to be acceptable to the student in reference to what other students do. There's many times that we think the replacement skill for the behavior would be that the student sits down quietly with their hands folded in their lap. Well, that may be a replacement, but it may not be something that the student really wants to do, and then in the near term, it may not be something that we can teach quickly. And so we want to see what other students are doing in that circumstance. And if they all are doing that, then that may be the goal, but it may also be that we say, in that circumstance, what are accepted ways to get attention or to reduce demands? When we do this work at the individual level, our focus in understanding is usually on one of four functions. We look at behaviors that occur because they allow us to escape an activity or situation, behaviors that occur as a means to get attention, behaviors that occur so that we can get tangible items, or behaviors that occur because they are self-stimulatory. Their reinforcement is that they provide their own sensory consequences. I have a colleague that came up with this cartoony picture here, the four common functions of behavior. The acronym, everyone eats, EATS, escape, attention, tangible, sensory. These would be the ideas we'd be keeping in mind as we're planning for the student. Now, many of us are familiar with a student who very much wants to get your attention, who comes up, leaves their seat because they know it's a reliable way to get someone to come over and direct them to sit down or to guide them to sitting down. Sometimes we're less immediately familiar with the idea of escape as a motivation, but any student who we see the pattern sometimes that a student might elect to engage in a behavior that gets them, sends them to the office for what's supposed to be as a disciplinary act, but the circumstances in which the behavior occurs or when they're asked to do a test or asked to do work in a subject area that is particularly difficult for that student. And so what we're concerned with in those cases is that being sent to the office is intended as a disciplinary consequence, but really serves as a reinforcing consequence because it gets the student away from something they didn't want to be part of. The student who wanted attention and has someone come over to direct them to sit down is receiving attention. The behavior is motivated to get this attention. At the individual level, this is really a very important part of what we want to study and as we're doing our functional behavioral assessment. The other aspect of the functional behavioral assessment that we want to acknowledge is that we sometimes look at the context for behavior as clues as to what is the function of behavior. In our literature, we talk sometimes about slow triggers and fast triggers. So we want to be sensitive to both those things that may be somewhat distant to the immediate circumstance that's guiding the student. Those are the slow triggers. Is this student generally healthy? When we're working with students with more significant disabilities, sometimes we want to make sure we can rule out concerns about ear infection or dental caries or a source of pain that the student is responding to and may in fact be responding in that they are hitting themselves on the side of their head, and that's judged to be a very significant behavior of concern. And it is in some ways a student's way of moderating the effect of pain that is caused by a physical condition. And so we want to be able to rule that out. In general, we want to know to what degree does this student come from a family where they are loved and feel connected and have a strong base in terms of emotional well-being and attachment, and that they're not working in some ways to recreate dysfunctional kinds of relationships at school that they might be having at home. What is the learning history that students bring in terms of success in this environment and having their behaviors positively affect other people? To what degree are students been exposed to trauma that has left a scar that has them less engaged with the environment and less engaged with the people around them? So those would all be considerations. It's hard to say exactly how they would fit into the behavior support plan, but clearly caring adults put attention and effort into ensuring that students feel connected and safe at school. When we're doing the functional behavioral assessment, we would be more likely to look at those things we call the fast triggers, that the specific social cue or the presence of specific people, that maybe there's environmental cues, that there's sounds or lights or the temperature in the room that the student is responding to. Maybe there are demands being placed on the student or specific requests that the student has a history of failing with, they respond strongly to. Or maybe that there's structure that's either quite present and the student is reacting to that, or it's quite absent and the student is responding to that. And so all of these would be potential, I'll say, clues that help us in our trying to understand what happens next. The next slide is in some ways quite simplistic, but it talks about the FBA hypothesis. The endpoint of the functional behavioral assessment should lead to the behavior intervention plan, that functions are identified, that a hypothesis is stated and tested. And I provide up there a little schematic that we have different data gathering systems that we use, and sometimes the teams or the teachers that we're working with are sort of helped by saying, how do I just focus on coming up with this hypothesis? So we provide this format that says this is a student by name who engages in this behavior. This concerns me because it's, and we have a checklist of things, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, why one would choose to intervene with the behavior. It occurs with this frequency in these places, and these are the known triggers. People often respond to this behavior by paying extra attention to the student, by removing demands, and this suggests that the behavior serves one of these four functions that we would look at. I then editorialize a little bit here with this format. The difficulty is that this behavior may be my child's way, the student's way of saying this, saying, I want attention, I don't want to be here, I want that thing, this behavior by itself feels good. The four functions, the way we respond may be reinforcing the behavior. So, with hypothesis in hand, and we find that as an exercise to be important for teams because it helps get them closure on the FBA process, we would then say, okay, how might we prevent this behavior from occurring? What changes could we make in the setting or the way we interact with this student that would make this behavior less likely to occur? And I do add here with the caution that this may not be appropriate for the long term. So we work with a student and say, what would help to have this behavior not occur? Well, if I had somebody with him all day long, this behavior wouldn't happen. Well, okay, so perhaps for the short run, we could increase the level of attention, increase the proximity to some staff member, some responsible adult, and that would provide an immediate reduction in the frequency or the intensity of the behavior. You don't have to act out to get attention because the attention's right there. And there's lots of ways that we could do this. Now, why prevent? First, because if you are not using your behavior to get attention, we can break the cycle that my behavior works to get attention. If the behavior doesn't occur, it can't be rewarded. For students who sometimes have escalating problem behaviors, if we prevent the behaviors, we don't have to work through them. Generally, it's a more positive climate. If a student truly is engaged in a behavior because they really, really want your attention, well, maybe attention's really important, and that's something we have to figure out a way to give more of. Or a student is engaged in a behavior to get out of a certain academic subject or away from a certain demand. Well, maybe we need to think about restructuring that demand in the long run, because it's okay to not want to do things that are particularly difficult. We have to support you in doing it, but it's a legitimate need to say, I don't want to be in a place where I am confronting failure or isolation or feeling like that I don't have other people around me. Why prevent? Because if behaviors don't occur, then other people can't be hurt, or so this protects and supports others. I used this line before, and so I'm recycling it here at the point of then saying, okay, we've reduced the level of the behavior through prevention. What do we do now? Well, behavior problems are solved when an individual has a new skill that occurs spontaneously in the circumstances that now trigger the behavior. There's lots of components to that, but the real important part is that it's a new skill. The second component is that it occurs on its own. It's under the control of the student spontaneously, and it happens in the circumstance that now trigger the behavior. I sometimes use the example for all of the folks attending the webinar that if when you're driving to work and somebody cuts you off and you've got somebody sitting with you in the car, but you feel really sort of energized and obsessed that this person was driving irresponsibly, if someone were to say to you at that point, someone else were to say to you at that point, I think you should relax. Most people would say, I think you should, and then for the sake of broadcast, I won't say fill in the blank, but there's something rude, probably. The behavior has to come from within at that point. And so if I'm going to relax, it is because I know I need to relax and take a deep breath and just say to myself, let it roll off your back. But if somebody else tells me to do that, I'm probably not going to do it. So these new skills or behaviors acceptable to the individual and others. Those of you who might work with adolescent boys that I've had the experience that they've said, I'm aggressive and I like being aggressive, and you know what, if I'm not aggressive, then people are going to think I'm a wimp, and I'm not going to accept that you want me to be the wimp. And we have to say to them how can you construct not being aggressive, which gets you into trouble, with a whole range of other behaviors like assertiveness or being able to negotiate a position that are not wimpy, that are in fact quite socially competent. Behaviors have to be efficient in that they work as well or better than the problem behavior in obtaining the outcome. A student who is confronting a difficult task, we might accurately teach that student to say, I am frustrated, when they are confronted with their difficult task. The problem with that is that a student who looks at an adult instructor in their environment with work in front of them that looks up and says, I am frustrated, I'm going to say about half the time that adult will not respond in a way that is nurturing of that student. Very likely they're going to say something like, well, too bad, finish it. You just have to do 5 more. I mean, there's going to be something that directs the student back to the task. In that same circumstance, if we choose to teach the student to say, I need help, I need assistance, then I can tell you that there's a far greater likelihood that the adult will respond in a way that is consistent with that request. Replacement skills allow the student, again, to avoid the negative consequences of the behavior. In selecting replacement skills, we want to make sure that it's something the person is capable of learning and doing. And this is my last point here is, and when in doubt, look at what socially successful peers do. My note here is it's often not what we teach. And I'll do an abbreviated version of this story, but a lot of times that when kids are in an unstructured place, they get into some kind of an altercation, and we bring them back in and say, all right, what happened? So, well, I got into the fight, or I got into, an argument with this person. And the adult says, okay, well, what could you have done, or what should you have done? And we wait to hear the magic words like, I should have told an adult, or I should have walked away. And I put this up here because I'm going to say that in most cases, successful peers do not tell an adult and they do not walk away. They figure out ways to deflate the strong emotions in a situation and disengage without pulling an adult into it, because that gets them labeled as being a tattletale or worse. There's a grid up here, and I'm certainly not going to go reading through this, but my colleagues here in Georgia put a literature review of the evidence-based practices as they relate to specific functions. And so the chart here provides some descriptions of interventions by brand name, scheduled exercise or behavioral momentum, check in or check out. There's a list of about, you can see there's about 20 or so different techniques, procedures, strategies that might be used, matched to, and when might this be considered. For a student with attention-getting behaviors, we might consider check-in and check-out, but we might not consider that for escape-motivated behaviors. And if you recall, when we talked about it, there's a big component of meeting with an adult at the beginning of the day, meeting with an adult at the end of the day, having a teacher at the end of each classroom as the class period provide feedback on performance during that class period. Well, there's lots of attention there that makes sense that that would work for attention-getting behaviors, and probably also makes sense that it not be something for a student who wants to avoid some kinds of social demands or academic demands. That technique may not be effective for them. And so down the line, one can see that there's a fair amount of literature on what do we do for students with attention-getting behavior. There's a fair amount of literature for students with escape-motivated behavior, and far less literature as it relates to those other functions of behavior, tangible and sensory. As a team is considering an intervention for a student, they might then look to a matrix like this to say, okay, this is the menu of options now. What do we think would work with the student? What would be the best way of tuning our intervention to the student's needs and the likelihood of us all being successful? That wraps the overview of the positive behavior intervention and supports, the tiered model as it's used in schools. And so we're going to gear up to move to how do we put this into place? What are some of the considerations we have in going to scale? So we talked about positive behavior intervention and supports, the tiered system. There's an extensive array of evidence supporting its use in schools. It's now being used in more than 20,000 schools. I think last estimate that I read was 22,000 schools across the United States. I know that there's 400 or 500 of them in Georgia that are using the approach. So that there's no question it's one of the right things to do, and it's in one of the interventions that probably has the strongest evidence base to support it. With that said, organizational change is its own science, and my next slide talks about going to scale with positive behavior support, meaning making sure that positive behavior support is available widely. And while this implementation, I say, may not be rocket science, it is unquestionably complex, difficult undertaking as we move to systems level implementation. So recall that I said our goal is that systemic interventions are in place and benefit 80 to 90% of students. Targeted interventions are in place and benefit at least 5 to 15% of remaining students, and individualized interventions are in place for 1 to 5% of students. And now I'll say that's for me the national goal. And then I have to ask how many students really have access to these interventions and who does not have access and why not. And so we go back to the issue of disproportionality again. I'm concerned about the individualized interventions and supports. What happens when we don't reach that? I'm using the 3% here on average, that those students have poorer outcomes, that they experience increased isolation and segregation. There's a high level of stress for their supporters. They're expensive, and they miss out on huge amounts of opportunity. Positive behavior supports, I argue that it's becoming a standard of practice. And with that, it has many challenges to being implemented the way it's supposed to be done. And that we still don't know a lot. Sort of how intensive should individualized supports be for a student? What intensity or frequency of intervention is necessary that we can predict to have change across the board? What are the true active components of our systems? How are we supposed to best train people to provide positive behavior supports? We have to acknowledge that there's still things we do not know. How much is enough? What intensity or frequency of any given intervention are absolutely required to support change? What are the true active components? How are people best trained? How do we maintain quality? How do we assure fidelity? And how do we support the supporters, the teachers, the paraeducators, the related service providers who are there and working with students? The goal of maintaining fidelity is absolutely important. With evidence-based practices, we know that if you don't do them the way they're supposed to do them, then frankly, it's not in the evidence base. There's a science of implementation that has these stages that are described in the literature of exploration, installation, initial implementation, full implementation, innovation, sustainability. Each of these would be a consideration for a school or district level team that was implementing positive behavior intervention and supports in that school or district. Installation relates to then getting folks staffed and getting the structure in place to support it. Initial implementation is that trial with we're ready to go and putting these procedures and supports in place. Full implementation says it's happening across the school. And now that we're doing it and assessing fidelity, we get to innovate. We get to say, how do we make changes that reflect perhaps unique needs? And then how do we assure sustainability? How do we keep this going in a way that doesn't rely on external training or technical assistance? Just as a comment, the evidence-based approaches, the evidence-based interventions, we place great faith in them, and as we should, but they are an amalgamation of what we know. Treatments that are demonstrated effective in a number of sometimes individual environments, sometimes even at the level of a state, but it's really a moving target that depends on being done with an integrity, but that integrity is based in part on having been demonstrated in more narrow and more limited circumstances. What do we know about delivering positive behavior supports? That one needs a knowledge base, one needs skill in how to do analysis and how to provide instruction. One needs the value and the attitude to do it right, to be committed to the outcome, to respect the student, to understand the role of a supporter, and the power of the organizational culture. As we consider introducing positive behavior supports in the schools, then one of the things we confront is sometimes, what is the organizational context for that? And does a school have the leadership that is needed? Do they have a mission and values that are consistent with implementing these procedures? Are the policies in place? Are there other kinds of supports or certification? Is there technical know-how? Does the school have the capacity to monitor performance, to implement improvement strategies, and to do ongoing data analysis on its effectiveness? So our challenges are sort of defining who we are, what we stand for, policy and practice. Our difficulties are that there's multiple elements to implementation, and that few of those elements, frankly, are unique to any evidence-based practice. That we sometimes have to go where we're not used to going, and we have to sometimes do what we were never trained to do. Positive behavior support, lots of challenges. We know what to do. We know how to do it. We know it's difficult to make it happen. So where do we go from here? Well, first, I think it's always important to celebrate the positive. We've made such gains in this area in the last 10 to 15 years that we know so much more, and we being much more effective with students across the country. What that means is we have to continue to advocate for the use of these approaches in the places and people that sometimes we're not used to dealing with, and sometimes that don't get access to the kinds of quality evidence-based interventions that are so necessary. We need you to lead, to be a voice for these approaches in your systems, and at the same time to support your leaders. Become a champion, but listen, to clarify what do we want to accomplish, to understand we have the tools for measuring outcomes and impact, but one of those things that we have to measure is, are our systems ready for change, and what do we have to do to get them ready? Other thing I think that we are in pursuit of is a need for efficiencies. The idea of how do we train folks to do this in a way that they can do it well, but we can train them relatively quickly. The educational endeavor is one that is based on time. Teacher time is a valuable commodity. How do we use it well? How do we look for efficiencies in how we do functional behavioral assessments? How do we look for efficiencies in how we develop support plans for individual students when that's what is necessary? How do we find efficiencies in monitoring? And then I think we also have to have an emphasis on evidence. How can we continue to demonstrate that these approaches have an impact on students, that the processes work, that we can report results in ways that are understandable to the varying constituencies that we have to answer to, that people are satisfied with these approaches, the students and the teachers and educational personnel who are putting them in place, and they lead to an enhanced quality of life. Let me then use this as a chance to sum up Summary point one of the things we know, children are not born with bad behaviors. And similarly, they do not learn positive behavior through negative, restrictive, aversive, limiting consequences. Children do learn positive behaviors through direct instruction, through modeling, through positive reinforcement, and practice. Some children need more support to do this, and that's the estimate of about 15%, and a few, about 3%, need much more. Reactive procedures, they're used in crisis. They're too often used repeatedly for the same student and the same behaviors. And by doing so, restraint, seclusion, and suspension become a de facto behavior plan, and noted earlier, one that doesn't teach. They too often ignore the context and triggers for the behavior, and they may inadvertently reinforce the behavior. Positive behavior support is an approach that's systemic. It's comprehensive. It involves all students at all levels. It's grounded in the science of human behavior and a value system that respects all. And it has a growing body of empirical support on its components and on the steps in implementation. PBIS implementations, more specifically, again, as I noted earlier, about 22,000 schools by my last read of how often, where it's being used, and it's probably, with more being added every year, probably an underestimate, but a huge commitment to this endeavor. Implementation, we do know, requires staff time for planning, it requires training, and it requires monitoring over a period of at least 3 years to get it implemented. Is it worth it? The improvements include school climate, in-class instructional time, and improved academic achievement, all very significant outcomes. Individualized supports can also be highly effective, needed by that small number of students. As a school-wide system, it builds a culture in which behavioral expectations are defined for all, that they're taught in all settings for all students, that they're monitored and rewarded, that there is corrective consequences for behavior errors, an ongoing data collection system to evaluate and improve. And one caution is that we can't expect school-wide efforts to affect students with chronic behavior problems. We do need those tiered supports for the relative few. We need to have a system for identifying those, the 15% that require more supports, and utilize those evidence-based approaches, such as check-in and check-out, that have been demonstrated to be effective. We do need a system for the very few, the 3%, who require individualized supports. We need to develop the capacity to conduct functional behavioral assessments and develop positive behavior intervention plans to teach replacement skills. And we need ongoing data systems to evaluate and improve the system. So that's the end of my remarks here. I do want to say thank you to the people at Presence Learning as the sponsoring organization, to my colleagues around the world and here at home, to the individuals with disability and their families who've really taught me how to be better at what I do, to the funders that have supported my work over the last 3 decades, and I thank all of you for your kind attention. I think we have time for some questions now, and I will turn it back to you, Clay, to moderate those questions.
Dan and Michael, I want to thank you for a fantastic presentation. People have been in the old days, I would say burning up the phone lines. I don't know what I say now, but there are literally hundreds of questions pouring in for you guys. So let's get started with those. The first one is for Dan. Can the strategies you've recommended be used for all age groups?
Well, thanks, Clay. Yeah, the short answer, and since we have them, lots of them coming in, I'll try to keep my answers on the short side. But the answer here is yes. The individualized interventions have strong support at all ages. The PBIS model and the tiered support model is a little bit newer in terms of its age. The first demonstrations were done in elementary school, but quickly began to, there's an understanding in the schools by the folks who will do this work that it had to happen at the middle school and high school level also. We've then since seen it sort of extended down in the age into preschool and even earlier. There are adaptations of the model for home, adaptations for alternative settings, and even some work in the adult systems around, both in this country and in many places around the world. So yes, the strategies are based in a science of behavior and are grounded in values that we think are very important. So that's my end.
Great. Michael, we have a question for you here as well. What are the alternatives to out-of-school suspensions?
Thanks, Clay. There are lots of alternatives, but let me go back to a principle that Dan alluded to before I offer some specific suggestions, and that's that if we're going to create a consequence, it should be linked to the behavior that has been shown. So if, let me give you an example, if there maybe is some destruction of property as one of the behaviors that's a concern, the alternative rather than an out-of-school suspension might be to figure out a way to replace that property or provide that property back to the person who had it destroyed, or if it was the school, how to contribute to its replacement. We shouldn't be separating consequences so that they have no connection necessarily to the behavior. Other types of alternatives are certainly in-school suspension, but we want to be careful about in-school suspension that it doesn't take the individual out of the academic environment and reduce the time in terms of receiving academic instruction. One of the real problems with any type of suspension is that it limits the knowledge and the skills that the student has an opportunity to gain, and we really don't want that to happen. So are there alternatives such as providing an additional small course that might focus on the student's behavior that the student would have to take after school or on a Saturday? This concept of mini courses has begun to take hold in a number of districts around the country where the student actually begins to look at their own behavior and try to figure out what is happening with that, and self-identifying some triggers, both the quick and the slow, as Dan referred to, and also to identify when they might be ramping up for a behavior that's not appropriate. Obviously, sometimes community service can be a substitute as well. That again is outside of school time. It's not during school time. Creating some behavioral contracts with the students. There are many different strategies that can be used as alternatives to suspension. And Dan, I don't know if you've got anything that you want to add there.
I think as we go through some of the other questions, Michael will probably have a chance to flesh out even further some of the alternatives.
Great.
And Michael, for those of our listeners who may not be familiar with mini courses or not have used them extensively in this context, can you suggest some individual mini courses or resources to help them find mini courses that might be helpful in their own context?
There's actually somebody who's done some real nice work in that area, and it's Reese Peterson out at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. So you might look to his work and how he's constructed some of those.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that tip. Dan, this next one is for you. So obviously prevention is the key to success, but in those moments when a student becomes aggressive and dangerous, how do we keep peers and adults safe without and de-escalate without restraint?
That's a great question, and I appreciate the fact that the questioner put the prevention and appreciation themselves for prevention at the top of the question. We can't be naive in this, and so we acknowledge we need crisis plans, and we need people who are really skilled at de-escalation in all of our settings. So, and there are training approaches that schools can use to help their personnel learn those skills. So we want to know, how can a student, if the student is, I'll say, aggressive and dangerous, how can that person be brought safely to a safe place and assisted in calming down? Or do they have to be left in place and others have to move? In which case, do we have a plan for that? It's really hard to do these things in the middle of a crisis. So if there is any chance that physical restraint will be used, the staff need training in how to do it safely. Really, it wants to be as brief as possible. And one of the elements of the legislation, both at the federal level and in most states, is that it's really important that parents be informed when these procedures are used, so that we do get everyone on the same page. There's a kind of an irony, and I wish I had data on this, that the more the systems that I have worked with that have really gone in a really committed way to training their staff how to use, if they do use a physical restraint, how to use it safely, and the staff actually find that the more they are trained, the less they use restraint. So that I think that there's an element of kind of confidence and understanding that there are alternatives, and that we can talk folks down and talk folks through that. The other piece that I guess I would ask that is, if folks have incidents that are frightening for all involved, and I'm going to say probably the student, him or herself, but certainly the staff and the folks surrounding them, that when that is worked through, whatever it took to work through it, that there is a group of folks that are pulled together to debrief, to analyze what happened here and what could we do differently tomorrow. How can things run more smoothly? And that's really that's the other aspect of prevention, is some single incidents occur, and we can't always see them coming. But it's really important for us to try to anticipate and use that information to have it not occur the next time we're together.
Michael, do you want to chime in on that?
Now, I think Dan's points are exactly right. I really want to emphasize the last 2 points that he made. That debriefing and then the planning of what to do instead is just critical. When there's an emergency, there's sometimes a sense of, okay, we got through that, but the absolute next step should be, how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? What do we put in place? You go back to your functional behavioral analysis and your behavior plans and tweak them and really get some feedback. And then the other thing Dan said is the connection with the family and where that child lives and what's happening there. Those are just critical components. So thanks.
And how do you recommend communicating to the children who are in the classroom after that incident is over about what they saw and what they experienced?
This is one of those times that I think just the truth works pretty darn well. Clearly, students, we saw that little Johnny or little Susie was having a really hard time today. Thank you for cooperating with us in having to have your life disrupted here. Be assured that little Johnny or little Susie, we're working with little Johnny and wanting to help him better control his behavior, and we're all in this together. So he needs your support. Please give it.
Good message. So here's another question I'd love to hear from both of you on. How do we get buy-in from staff and from reluctant teachers, counselors, and administrators for positive behavior strategies?
Michael, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll jump in, because partly, Dan, I think you addressed some of this during your comments. This is about systems change and about organizational change, and as Dan said during his presentation, it's a very complex process. And not one person in one organization doesn't always change in the same way, so I would actually recommend a multi-pronged approach. One of them is to get people information. And if you go to a site called PBIS.org that the U.S. Department of Education funds, there is a lot of information about the prevention components and what ends up happening to a school that implements a school-wide positive behavioral approach. So what you'll have there for the people who respond to it and value it is data. You'll have that information that talks about the effectiveness in terms of reduction of certain types of behavior, the increases in academic accomplishment, the general tenor and feel of the school overall. There's a lot of the documentation there for that type of approach. I would also recommend backing up and not focusing only on the behavioral components, but talking about that this isn't just about students who have challenging behaviors, but this is about actually creating an academic environment for everybody where everybody can succeed. That's one of the real benefits of a school-wide approach. It's not about kids in special ed. It's not about kids with specific challenging behaviors only. It really is a benefit for everybody, including the staff and including the families that are participating in this. And then there are going to be cases where you need to do kind of a one-on-one discussion with certain people who have been through multiple initiatives in schools, which is not an unusual thing at all. But the good thing is that if you look at what Dan was saying about 22,000 schools in the country implementing this or more, you've got real clear data that says this is a recommended practice. This is an effective practice overall. The final thing I would say is that you really do need a systems buy-in, and particularly from leadership, you need this. I have not been in a school where it has only been implemented from the ground up by teachers or by teachers and families. Administrators really need to buy into this. So as you're beginning to put this together, it needs the support of building administration. It needs the support of district administration to be able to implement this.
I think that's great, and I would add just a couple of things to that, Michael. One of them is that in the world of implementation research, that idea of going to scale, there is a dedicated stage that is called exploration, in which I would really want teachers talking to teachers, parents talking to parents, administrators talking to administrators, you know, if possible, students talking to students, so that in the school that is even considering this, to say, what is in it for me? How will my life be better? How will we be more effective in working together? So how do we create a win and win and win for all involved? We get cynical sometimes that, you know, I've seen new curricula come and go, and it's always something new. Well, we don't want folks to say, oh, this is just the latest fad. So that's the piece that people should study it, should understand that it is I'll say in everyone's best interest to improve school culture. This is a great way to do it.
Yeah, and Dan, I would add one more component, that a real concrete thing. The place where I've seen this implemented very effectively and relatively quickly, and I couldn't agree with you more that this is a 3-year approach, an implementation approach. You really don't get this type of systemic cultural change quickly, but the component that I've found really, really useful is to actually have a coach that that teachers can go to, that administrators can go to when there's an unseen glitch or bump that happens, that there's a coach from another district, or there's an expert that they can call in. Often somebody who's on the ground or is maybe responsible across the district or in a neighboring district, who can really help individual classroom teachers or administrators work through the challenges that eventually pop up when these types of approaches are implemented.
Good point.
Great. So here's another good tactical question. and Dan, if you could tackle this one, it'd be great. What kinds of questions should we be asking ourselves at team meetings and IEPs when dealing with students who have multiple disciplinary issues?
It's an interesting framing of the question, and I'm going to say I think I'm going to give an answer that may not be what everyone will predict. What I'm thinking people will predict is that I will go right into what are the questions associated with the functional behavioral assessment. I would actually back up a little bit from that to say, who in this room is here for this student to really be committed to their success? I'm sometimes concerned when we start planning and we find out sort of halfway through our meeting that, you know, frankly, nobody likes this kid very much, and somebody's got to in the room. Somebody really has to be connected and want this student to succeed. Once we do that, we have I'm going to say the techniques are there in a literature. There's books on it. There's questionnaires to go through, including students with multiple disciplinary issues. But then once we have somebody who's really committed to making the change, we'd go through those processes and determine is there one or more functions that we have to be addressing in our educational efforts.
What a great insight. I'm really glad you shared that. Michael, could you give me some examples when the use of restraint is appropriate and when it is not?
So you heard that hesitation there, Clay, partly because the assumption of the question is that there's an appropriate time, and I would argue that there are darn few appropriate times when a restraint should be used, and it would be in emergency situations when there is imminent danger to a student himself or herself, to another classmate, or to a staff member. But beyond that, there really is not an appropriate time. And by imminent danger, I really mean that there is physical harm that will quickly occur to somebody. And that would be the only case in which I would see restraint as being used. And then what needs to happen is that there needs to be quick transition to a cooling down period, to making sure that either the staff person, him or herself, or somebody who can be called in that can help de-escalate behavior quickly, and help, frankly, get that student to a point where they are feeling more positive and more in control. If a student reaches that point, it's very unpleasant for them as well. And we have to remember that it's not just the risks to staff and other students and the students themselves, but they're going through what essentially is a trauma. And we need to make sure that we're beginning to turn around that experience as quickly as possible. So from my definition, Clay, it's a very, very limited time when it should be used.
Well, thank you for that. Like I said, the virtual phone lines are burning up, but unfortunately, we are out of time here. So I want to thank you both a lot for your presentation, and I'm just so sad we have to wrap up because there's so many great questions out there. If you're considering a new phase of your career, please know that presence learning is growing rapidly. If you or someone you know is interested in working from home on their own schedule and making a huge difference in children's lives, refer them to our website to learn more about working online with Presence. We are looking for the best speech therapists, occupational therapists, counselors, psychologists, social workers, and special education teachers. And mark your calendar now. Our fall series wraps up on Tuesday, November 17th, with Barry Prezant and his colleagues Emily Rubin and Amy Laurent, who will present an introduction to CERT. This is an evidence-based positive behavior support model that is having excellent outcomes around the world, and especially for children with autism. This is a program you and all your special education team will not want to miss. You may wonder what happens next. You'll be getting an email from me with your certificate of attendance and links to the recording of today's program, as well as a resource handout. Please share the link and recommend this program to your colleagues, as well as others in this series and our entire sped ahead archive of nearly 40 professional development programs from our expert faculty. For those of you who have requested ASHA CEUs, we will immediately submit your attendance information to ASHA, but please know that it may take a few weeks for them to update your records. Finally, I would like to thank all of you for participating. Everyone at Presence Learning is committed to unlocking the potential of every child and providing you with world-class professional development. Be assured, your feedback and suggestion for our programs is valued and appreciated. So in a minute, you'll be directed to a survey for today's webinar. Please let us know what you thought about today's program and your suggestions for future topics and speakers. For more info or to see a live demo of our online therapy services, email us at schools@presencelearning.com. Thanks again for making this webinar part of your day.